Hello all and welcome to Film School Dropout. My name is Ben Friedman, film critic, and today we're talking Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. You know, there's always exciting things to talk about in this series, and one of the ones that I found was when talking about Martin Scorsese, there's titles you don't know, and Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore was a movie that I really just didn't have an awareness of. I knew it was Ellen's first Oscar. I knew that this had come out right after she was in The Exorcist in '73, so I did know some history of it. But I was excited to dive into this movie, and just learn more what it was about and why it was so acclaimed, and essentially why it allowed Scorsese to do what he does for the rest of the 1970s. This is, if you will, the film that gives him leverage to make Taxi Driver. Joining me today is writer and podcaster over at Next Best Picture. He is an Oscar nerd. He is a great podcast guest. I met him through a mutual colleague, Brian Rowe. This is Cody Dericks. Cody Dericks will be joining me for Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, and he's a really insightful, very nice, very friendly, very funny guy, and I can't wait for you guys to hear what he has to say. I believe we have a good conversation. All credit to Cody. That is none of my doing. I come off a little nervous in this episode. I don't know why. Maybe this was one of the first movies in this series, which I should just admit, I believe Cody and I recorded this back at the end of July, maybe beginning of August. This was one of the first movies for the series when I was recording it that I had never seen the movie for the first time. So I did get to watch this once or twice pre-recording. But unlike some of Martin Scorsese's other titles like The Departed, like Goodfellas, you know, I've seen those films before. Alice, I just had to kind of live with this new perspective. I didn't have any history on it. Thus, I kind of just go in blind. And it makes for a very nerve-wracking conversation when you're hosting, especially when Cody is definitely far more familiar in the subject matter than I am. But regardless, I believe we have a really great conversation for you for Alice Doesn't Live Here. All credit to Cody for coming on this show. Thank you so much for joining me. And everyone, welcome to Film School Dropout, and we'll be right back.
God, I hate that place. I said I would hate it, and I was right. I hate it. But I earned $17 in tips today. Not bad, huh? And Mel said that I'm sure I'd do better in a week or so.
Bring this episode end of July. And today we are focusing, and it's always hard for me to keep it in order because I'm recording this series out of order. Today, I am recording the episode on Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. And my guest is Cody Dericks from Next Best Picture. Have I gotten everything right at this moment? I always get worried with long titles. I'm like, did I say that right?
It's a long title. Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. There's a lot of meaning conveyed in that title.
it's just like, oh, I could have just said another word in there. Did I add a word? Did I subtract a word?
Mm-hmm.
But that's what we're talking about today. Cody, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. And this is a fun week to really get into recording this one. And Cody, I'm sure we'll talk about Scorsese as we go on with the series, but this is a fun experience for me because we're really early on in the Scorsese filmography, and this is the first movie of the series that I've recorded so far where I've never seen the movie before today, or I guess yesterday when I watched it. Like, this is the first one where I really just came into a movie fresh and didn't know the direction that I was going to approach with this movie. And so that's a really exciting thing to talk about because I really feel like my maybe ideas or even knowledge of this movie is so fresh in the sense that I didn't know. Did you know this was a 9-season TV show that aired in the 70s?
That was news to me on this watch. I'd seen this movie already, but that was brand new information for me, which I would imagine is most people's, at least from that time period, their predominant memory of this character is that TV show that ran for almost a decade.
Oh, I also want to tell you, I'm thinking about watering down the chicken soup.
How? You already use chicken like a tea bag now.
Look, I'm doing it for you.
Mel, would you like to do something for me?
Yeah, what?
Kiss my
Yeah, no, that's how my mom knows this movie, because I was watching
Mhm.
movies with her this weekend. Just note, I'm doing the Alice Doesn't Live Here and Kundu episode back to back. And
That's a
so
wild double feature.
it's a wild one for me. And it's specifically a weird one for me, just with how tonally different they are. But so when I gave my mom the option, like, let's watch one of them, and I'm like, Alice Doesn't Live Here anymore. And then she's like, I feel like that premise in movie sounds familiar. I feel like I saw it. And then when I was researching yesterday, I'm like, did you ever watch the TV show, Alice? And she's like, oh, yeah, like I watched all of it. And so this is a really crazy one, because the cultural impact of it is basically almost to some degree from people from that time era. It's probably more the TV show than it is actually the movie itself.
Right. Or for people like me who are Oscar dorks, we knew it as Ellen Burstyn's Oscar, which I knew before it was to me, known as like a Martin Scorsese movie, because on paper it doesn't appear similar to a lot of Scorsese movies, especially in this time period. In terms of like subject matter and perspective, it's definitely different for him at this time period.
I'm glad you bring it up, because I think that's actually the part that I was most interested in on this movie, was that in, what is it? I think so Mean Streets is 1973.
Yeah, this is
Alice
74.
Doesn't Live Here is 74, and then Taxi Driver is 76.
Yeah, that's quite a sandwich.
That is a wild, like, 4 years of filmography.
Mhm.
Like, and he has it a few times where it's just like, oh my God, he did this movie and this movie back to back. But this one in particular is just like, what I found so interesting watching this movie is just like, oh my God, I like, this is who Scorsese is as an indie director early on in his career.
Right, it does feel like something that we'd see nowadays at like Sundance or something like that, in terms of like the subject matter and the scale of it all, and he's going for some really interesting, subtle, but still noticeable directorial moments. It's not entirely just a road movie, but it's also not like hyper new Hollywood in its techniques. It's definitely sitting comfortably in the middle.
And I was trying to think, was this the only time Scorsese has really ventured west for his filmography? I mean, I'm sure there's been other times where I know like Silence, he's in like feudal Japan, but like,
sure, yeah.
Like, I'm trying to think, like, in the idea of that this is a modern movie set, you're supposed to believe it's sometime around 1974. Like, is this the only time he ever really goes to California in his films? I couldn't think of another film that off the top of my head. Because where's
Right, 'cause
Shutter
he's
Island set?
very much, which one?
Where's
Shutter
Shutter
Island? I do
wanna
want to say that's like Boston.
I was kind of thinking Brooklyn area, but like I was still thinking east.
Okay, I haven't seen the movie since I was in theaters. All I remember is in the trailer, Leo has some sort of crazy accent that sounds kind of Boston-y, but maybe that's just for his character.
Yeah. No, like I said, so I don't think he's done a West movie, like a
No, he
literal
sticks to the East
California.
Coast.
Yeah, so that was another element of this movie where I'm just like, because I'm a West Coast, like, born and raised, so like seeing Monterey in particular, like not knowing that the movie was going to lead to Monterey for a big chunk of this like story was just another like iteration where I'm just like watching and I'm like, I don't fully like, this is such a distinctly unique style within Scorsese's filmography. But I guess we're touching on Alice a little bit earlier. Cody, I just want to ask you before we really get into it, because I always want to ask my guests is, what is your relationship with the man himself, Martin Scorsese?
So I feel like all of us young cinephiles at some point when we're young and we're coming up and learning the classics and, going to our local library or video store, if you're my age, or streaming services, if you're younger than me, and looking for the movies you have to watch, the important ones, you'll eventually get to Scorsese sooner rather than later. And for me, I remember watching movies like Taxi Driver and Raging Bull quite young. I want to say 13 or 14, which is probably too young to fully appreciate those films. So for a while, he kind of just sat in my head as this, this Mount Rushmore kind of director in terms of Hollywood's history. And then I started watching them as they were coming out once I became a full adult. And so that was, Wolf of Wall Street, Silence, these movies that are so different in terms of subject matter and perspective and style. And I really got turned on to him as a director. And now he's one of my favorites, which is not a brave thing to say. I feel like most people would say that if they're really into film, that, you know, he's one of the greatest of all time, if not at least working right now. But yeah, I mean, I feel like I don't have a stunning answer for what does he mean to you, because I think he's one of the best directors working and one of the best directors of all time.
It's so weird with a guy like Scorsese, because like some of the other directors, and I feel like I sometimes reiterate it because I record these episodes all back to back that I forget where I talk about this idea. But like specifically, I was thinking today with Scorsese is some of our other great directors we get introduced to by a certain movie because we're that age and maybe they're so relevant for our parents. Like, case example, Steven Spielberg. We get introduced to him probably much younger than we do a Scorsese, because he made Jaws, because he made E.T., because he made Indiana Jones, like all that. George Lucas we get introduced to because of Star Wars. I'm trying to think of some other directors where this is the case in point. If your parents or grandparents like mine were super into Westerns, then you got introduced to John Ford even like a lot younger than I ever got introduced to Scorsese. And then like some of these other directors where it's just like, even like, I'm trying to think of a Kubrick is just a weird one, where Kubrick's, you know, The Shining, even though I didn't see The Shining until I'm like 13 or 14, I'd seen that Jack Nicholson poster like at Blockbuster my whole life. So there was just images of it. Scorsese is a weird one where you kind of have to like learn about Scorsese. I feel like there's an introduction to you for where someone like, almost like someone tells you like, hey, Scorsese is one of the guys and you need to like start watching these movies, because there's not as much. I mean, I guess Goodfellas has its certainly, like there's a lot of iconic iconography associated with Scorsese for sure. It's just not necessarily readily available as much as it is when you're a younger person. Like younger people are not likely to stumble on Mean Streets.
Right. I feel like you're likely to, the most you'll find when you're a kid or a teenager, if you're not super into movies yet, in terms of Scorsese references, is like, are you talking to me? You know, moments like that from Taxi Driver, or just the existence of his gangster movies, you know, Goodfellas and all that. So, but I don't think he's somebody that when you're younger, your parents are going to pop in Cape Fear into the DVD player. So yeah, I know what you mean.
Do you remember the first movie you saw of his in theater?
In theaters? Ooh, Shutter Island, actually. Yeah.
Shutter? It was
definitely. Shutter? Yeah, I was in college. I remember going to see it opening weekend. It was a crowded theater, which is amazing for a movie that opened, I think, in January or February.
I think it's February of like 2010. Because like the whole thing about that movie was it was like supposed to come out 2009 for Oscar season, and then it just gets bumped by the studio like pretty last second, if I recall.
Yeah, and it was still a hit. So
yeah. And that, like, because I was also sitting back today where I'm just like, what was my first Scorsese movie in theater? Because I kept saying the answer was Silence. And like, that doesn't actually sound right. And then I'm like, okay, I was obviously too young for The Departed. I was too young for Shutter Island. I'm like, I definitely have not seen Hugo. And then so I'm like, so it's Silence. And I'm like, why does that not sound right? And I realized it's because like, I sneaked into Wolf of Wall Street for 20 minutes before I got found out and got kicked out. I was like 15 or 16.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's just like, you know, like we all get kind of exposed to Scorsese at one point or another. And I also think that's kind of the nature of Scorsese. And I'll tie it back to Alice in a second, but it's like this idea of, especially when you're younger, Scorsese seems a little bit more perverse than your Spielberg. Like he's certainly, like, at least in my household growing up, Scorsese wasn't someone that my like mom had necessarily patience for. Like she wasn't a Goodfellas mother, I should say. She wasn't like one of these, you know, like The Last Temptation of Christ had come out and like to a lot of his audience had kind of alienated him forever. Taxi Driver is this uber violent, disturbing movie. Like there was a quality to him growing up that it did always seem a little bit grimmer, a little bit nastier, and like just the tad bit like perverted compared to some of his contemporaries or peers.
Right. I always knew him as like the gangster filmmaker, because
Mhm.
you grow up with Goodfellas, Mean Streets. When I was coming up, it was The Departed. So these movies that look at the seedy underbelly of society, and not even just gangster necessarily, like underbelly, because Taxi Driver is definitely about people on the fringes of society.
Mm.
Raging Bull is about a misanthropic boxer. So it's
Mm.
really not the kind of thing that, again, you would show a kid, or you would be gravitated towards as a kid yourself. And I, like I said earlier, I watched Taxi Driver, Raging Bull young and didn't really understand the whole appeal, and then watched them later as a real person and totally got it.
That's another point that you hit on right there that I also found. I think a lot of people get this for their exposure to Scorsese, is you hear some of the controversies around this movie, and then you watch it thinking it's going to be one thing. Like, I remember when I put on Taxi Driver, I'm probably like 14, and I'm like, this is going to be the bloodiest, most disturbing, most like violent movie I've ever seen. And then like the shootout is like, like just a few minutes, and it's like older, it's very disturbing, but at the time it's like, well, that's not The Rock. Like The Rock's way more bloody and just like violent than that is. And like, so I feel like that kind of colored our impressions of him for a second, where I know for me, it took me many years to kind of appreciate Scorsese as the guy who directed Taxi Driver. Because when I watched Taxi Driver, I'm like, this movie is kind of a nothing for me because I didn't get it.
Same. Yeah, I had the same exact reaction. I feel like that a lot of movies at that time period have such a reputation now. I always think of the first time I watched The Exorcist when I was 14 or 15. I was so excited for this movie that, you just hear, oh, it's the scariest movie ever made, and
Exactly right.
people were throwing up in the theater, and there were ambulances. And so you watch it and you're expecting wall to wall jump scares and scary moments, and it's not. It's much more patiently paced and deliberate with its scares. And then now watching it as an adult, I find it terrifying. I find
Yeah,
the
no,
sense
I
of
agree.
dread terrifying, and the way it builds on real fears and real anxieties of not just parents and their children, but adults in general. I find that much scarier than some of the more disposable films that I probably found scarier when I was 13 or 14.
That's the thing. Look, The Exorcist is a great example because I saw The Exorcist and The Exorcist of Emily Rose, I believe is the title of that movie.
Yep, I saw that in
Is that the
theaters. It
title?
scared me
Emily
a
Rose?
lot.
Like, to me, Emily Rose was the much scarier movie, right? It's not
Me
until you get
too.
older.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I'm trying to get with Scorsese right now, is like, we do get exposed to him at such a young age because any film fan will stumble upon Scorsese eventually. Like, he is one of the, not even one of the, like, questionably, he is on the Mount Rushmore of film directors, like, unquestionably. So you stumble on him and then you find him, and then like you're built on this perspective where even that's been something fun with this series that I've been doing, where I'm just like, even some of my preconceived notions of who Scorsese is as a filmmaker get broken when I see a movie like Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore for the first time. And I'm just like, I actually don't understand who this guy is as a filmmaker all the time, because this movie is so radically different from anything that I've ever understood of him, and anything that I've ever actually thought he was necessarily interested in covering. Like, I don't even know how I'm trying to put it with the phrase of what I was expecting Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore to be, but I mean, I didn't expect kind of a road drama comedy. Like, it was a bizarre experience for me.
I think what I find most surprising about it is, on paper, you can describe it as, I don't want to say simply, but you could describe it simply as a woman loses her husband and embarks on the road with her son for a new life. And how many movies are there that are about, we're going to make a fresh start, we're going to go somewhere else, we're going to learn something about ourselves in the process, even if we don't know it. And what I think is most impressive about Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore is how understated it is in terms of like the discoveries of the character. They don't really go through any huge life-changing moments. There are traumatic incidents and noteworthy moments to be sure, but on paper it's, gets a job at a diner, tries to be a singer. These supposedly insignificant moments that, if it was, somebody telling you a story about their friend, you would think that was just a nice story about their friend. But the way Scorsese crafts it and has these actors live through the characters, and I think his biggest contribution to this film as a director is the unity of the acting ensemble. It's just unbelievable. It turns it into something almost profound about the way we move through life and the way we interact with each other as people.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And there's this documentary that Scorsese made in like 1997. It's him going back to Italy and him studying film history of Italian cinema. And I'm blanking on that documentary name. It's something like My Voyage to, I think it might be specifically My Voyage to Italy or something along those lines. But what's so interesting, and I was re-listening to sections of that documentary today, is he talks a lot about the ideas of parents. And that's something that is very instrumental in understanding his filmography, and specifically like the loyalty of a family and how that exact second that loyalty is ever broken, it's hard to rebuild that, and how people come back from that essentially. And then like bringing that into the context of Alice, I'm not saying that loyalty is ever broken, but it is so fundamentally important to understand Scorsese this is a family guy. Like, this is a guy who loves his mom. And that's kind of the summation that I had with this movie, was just like, this is a guy who has a deep understanding and love of what his mom does in his life. And that's not to say like his mom lived this exact life that Alice did, but he can certainly see the sacrifices she made as a mother into his life and can identify that.
Right. I mean, I would be curious to see how much of this specific movie he's drawing from his own relationship with his mother, because the thing about it is I find it so current and so of its time period. This is such a 70s film. I mean that in the best way possible. I mean that in terms of the style, in terms of the specifically the relations between the characters, how they interact with each other, especially Alice and her son. I find that such a typified post-hippie era relationship between parent and child. You know, you got to figure Alice is somebody who went through the turbulent 60s, became a mother, I assume sort of young. I'm not sure exactly how old Ellen Burstyn is in this or how old Alice is supposed to be, but she's not that old.
She is supposed to be 33 in this 33, movie.
Okay. And her son is about 12, I'd say, probably.
The son?
11?
I thought he was like 8.
Kids are. 8?
I thought he was like 7 or 8. I'm not positive. Now that you say it, I'm not positive, but I definitely thought it was like closer to like 7 or 8.
You know, to me, a child is a child. I just don't know. But actually, I'm going to look this up because I am curious now, because that would change a lot about what I thought of the movie.
Because if I'm correct, Alice is 8 years old when we first meet her in that like flashback sequence. And then I think it says however many years later. And I think I did the math, and I think she was about 33.
Okay. Well, the actual actor who played her son is 12 in this movie.
Oh, okay. Wow. Okay. So apparently I'm the bad one at
well, you know, they do that thing where they cast child actors and you're supposed to assume they're 4 years younger than they actually are. They always
or that
up, I feel like
that, or they get Cillian Murphy to just play a really young Oppenheimer with black hair.
Let's just split the difference and say he's a 10-year-old child. So
yeah, we'll go 10. That's a good number.
So what that means is that Alice had him in her early 20s. So she was a young mother who, maybe not young for the time, but young in terms of a lifespan. And she went through this time period in the 60s, and now it's the 70s, and it was an era of reflecting upon that era on the 60s and looking back and seeing what we learned from it, what we didn't learn from it, and kind of processing it into people's real lives. And I think that is so apparent in the relationship between her and her son.
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
Modern. Yeah. They're like friends rather than parent and child at times.
It's so weird because that was kind of the same read I had on the movie, where I was like, this is surprisingly, and maybe I'll just preface this. Do you ever, and I'm sure you have this, but do you ever have that moment when you read a premise for a movie from like the 1950s, 60s, or 70s, and instantly you're like, oh, I don't know if this is a good idea for this person to be tackling this movie?
Sure. Yeah, I know what you mean. Which is any film directed by men about women.
Yes, exactly. So when I heard what this premise of Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore is, I'm just like, okay, like, let's see what it's about. But like instantly I was just like, there might be some really dated ideas in this movie. And that's not to say there aren't some dated ideas in this movie, but it is handled far more maturely and far more nurturing than I thought it would be. It's a very delicate movie in sequences. Like, it is a
Yes.
very soft touch from Scorsese, from a guy who, Scorsese is such a talent, but subtlety has never been necessarily what I associate Scorsese, especially in the 70s, with.
Well, what I think makes Alice such an interesting character, and Scorsese brings this out in Ellen Burstyn's performance, is that she is depicted in all her mediocrity,
Mhm.
in all her lack of specialness, which is not to say she's not worth following in a film, but you see so many moments of her do something and then regret it, and then apologize to that person or express to that person their thoughts on the moment. You see it in her interactions with the waitress played by Diane Ladd. You see it in her interactions with her son. And I think there's something interesting there to depict somebody who's, again, not flawed, but not perfect. They just are. And that's what a lot of this movie is. It's just looking at these characters as they are. And I think it's making a case for it's almost like a movie about the examined life. You know, that the idea of like the unexamined life is not worth living, because this life is being examined, maybe not necessarily by Alice, but us as the audience and Scorsese as the director.
No, yeah, no, I totally agree with that read of it. The aspect of that you mentioned that I found so not enlightening, but there are just moments where you just accept Alice is who Alice is, and that she will make certain mistakes in certain scenes, or she will just be harsher in certain scenes, or she will be maybe a little too gentle in other scenes. Like, that was a choice that actually pays off really well with the movie. And I'm saying this again more as just it's so much of Ellen's performance in this movie, and it's so much of Scorsese kind of just allowing Ellen to act in this movie in a way that feels very naturalistic. Like, it does feel very true to life. And that's tough combo to pull off.
Yeah, I think that's what makes the Ellen Burstyn performance so impressive, is the complete lived-in quality of it. This is somebody who, even knowing Ellen Burstyn fairly well as an actor, as I do, and as audiences did at the time, this is, I think, her third Oscar nomination. So she's not even, it's not like she's a new face in Hollywood or to audiences. You still believe her as a fully rounded person. And Ellen Burstyn, I believe, is a method actress. So you have to imagine she was fully immersing herself in this character. And it's not like there's a lot of distinguishing qualities to Alice that you haven't seen in her previous work, in Last Picture Show, in The Exorcist. But there's still such truth to be found in her performance that I buy every single second that this is a real person.
Yeah, her performance is definitely the performance to talk about in this movie.
Mhm.
She is so, I already said the word natural, and yet it's still the word that comes
It's
up.
hard to not use that word. I know what you mean.
Like,
when you
it's
talk about
just
this
like there's
performance.
something like so real about it. Like, there is and this was another element when watching the movie. I'm like, that's something I really can't say I've seen Scorsese capture. It has a documentary feel to it, where it's just the camera is so non-intrusive in certain scenes, where it's just like, it feels so, the world itself feels so lived in. And that's due to the talent of Ellen just being able to just kind of take everything and kind of mold it to what she needs it to do. And especially with this relationship that you picked out with the son, her son in the movie, where it's just like, this could have this the kid could have gotten really annoying really quickly. And I think to a degree
Yes,
he is
definitely.
slightly annoying, but on purpose. But it never feels like he is the 12-year-old showing attitude, right? Like, you understand this child as a real person as well, and that's largely due to the fact that he and his mother have a just authentic relationship that's pretty unimaginable to replicate as an actress, right?
How long do you think we'll have to stay in this hellhole? Quit it, Mom. Quit it, Mom. You better stop.
Right. I think the child performance, I'm looking at this actor's name because I think he stopped acting shortly after this, actually.
If
Uh,
I'm correct, I think he starred in the TV show for a few seasons, and I think they switch it. I think
let's
he's in the show
see.
Alice for like a season or two. Maybe I misread that.
He was in the pilot only.
Only the pilot.
So he did just the pilot and then he was replaced by an actor. His name is Alfred Letter. He's still with us. He is now a computer engineer, it looks like. It looks like he left acting fairly soon after this movie. Which is all well and good. You know, plenty of child actors don't go on to make it their career, but I think he's extraordinary in this film. And a lot of times when you see a great child actor performance, uh the first instinct is to credit the director. And I do think directors have a maybe stronger hand in shaping a child's performance than an adult performance. And you see it especially when child performances are not great. It usually is in movies that are directed with a less sure hand. But the actor himself brings such variance to the character. You know, he has such incredible line readings. He's constantly like singing little songs and doing little bits with his mom, and it does feel, like you said, their relationship feels totally real.
Yeah, when you said that line about directors who maybe don't always know how to direct children, my first thought went to Florence Zeller in The Son, which
Oh
was like, I
boy.
think one of the worst depictions I've like
Not
ever
the
seen in a
Son.
movie ever. I
That
couldn't
movie.
believe it. I saw I saw it a month or so ago. I was just at work and I'm like, you know what? I'll just turn it on as background noise. And there were certain scenes where I would just like turn my head. I'm like, wait, what's he doing as an actor right now?
It's insane. That's got to be one of the steepest declines from film to film for a director I've ever seen.
It was
It's just, you know, the father is so good and then the son is not that at all.
I couldn't believe what was happening in that movie. But yeah,
Yeah.
on the Son in this movie, there is such a this is a really I don't want to not emphasize how difficult of a job this was for the kid as well. Like, if this performance goes wrong, I think the movie itself actually doesn't work. Like,
I
if the kid
agree.
is
Yeah.
bad, this movie just Alice doesn't feel as believable. And again, that's this idea of what Scorsese is doing. Just kind of, I'm trying to think of the word. I don't know if naturalistic is the right word that I would describe with this direction. It's certainly, I'm trying.
It's hard not to use that word. I get
I
it. When
know
you're
I'm
talking about this
trying
movie,
not to
because it's
use
just
the
so
word authentic, but it is in this moment. It's just you're seeing it and you're just like, how did Scorsese understand this? That's the point of this movie that I just kept hitting on, where I'm just like, I don't, who is Scorsese right now to me?
yeah. I mean, I think you're right about the movie not working without the kid working, because not only are they together almost the entire movie as a pair, the emotional climax of the movie has entirely to do with him. It has to do with the father, the Kris Kristofferson character, you know, smacking this kid, and then the kid drinking with Jodie Foster when Alice kicks him out of the car. So all these things are part of the emotional climax of the movie. And if you're not bought on with their relationship as mother and son, not say you wouldn't care, because I think Alice is such a well-crafted character, but you definitely care less. And so I think it's a credit to the child performance and Scorsese and Ellen Burstyn working with this actor that it all works totally.
Do you remember the first time you saw this movie?
Yes, I saw it a few years ago when I was just catching up on Oscar-winning performances I hadn't seen.
Mhm.
And I think this was like next in the Netflix queue
Yeah.
because I still get the DVDs. It's true. I'm gonna be one of the last users when
You
it
still, like,
cancels in
to this
September.
day, July 2023, you still do the one at a
Yes.
time?
Well, I had it set up for a long time, and then I cut it when I got laid off a few years ago. So
Sure.
fun. But then I picked it back up when they said they were getting rid of it, because I want to make sure I filled in some blind spots for movies that
Mm.
are hard to see otherwise. It's just a good way to get. I mean, it was past tense at this point. I'm sure it'll be gone by the time this is uploaded, but it was a great way to
Yeah.
see movies that you couldn't see easily otherwise. But anyway, I caught this one when I was catching up with Oscar-winning performance I hadn't seen yet, and at the time, it didn't quite strike me as anything super profound. This was again a few years ago. I think it was during quarantine, so who can even speak to the quality of my brain at that time? But rewatching it recently for this, it was much more impressive to me. And maybe that's because I'm like you, I'm watching Scorsese's films in order to lead up to Killers of the Flower Moon. So maybe watching it, knowing what he's doing as a director up to that point, it is a better way to look at it, because you have to imagine that's what audiences were thinking at the time. And it's definitely an interesting thing to see come from Scorsese, even knowing what he goes on to become.
It's so wild to me, like this is his trajectory. I just recorded the episode of Who's That Knocking at My Door,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yep.
and obviously Mean Streets and Boxcar Bertha happened between Who's That Knocking at My Door and Alice. And what I was also just so struck on is I'm just like, people were not even that people, we identified him as the great like American filmmaker pretty early on, like basically post Alice. Like this gives him his blank check to make uh Taxi Driver. Like the whole reason
Right.
Taxi Driver is allowed to be made is because Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore did so well at that year's Academy Awards. And in that, I was just like, obviously, we can identify him as a great filmmaker fairly early on, but it's just like, who would have known this was the filmmaker that we were going to get with this type of movie that is Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, where it's just so different, not necessarily different than his rest of his filmography, and also like so similar in other ways. Like I that was the thing when I was going back. I've been reading this book right here. It's the Twain's Filmmakers series. It's Martin Scorsese by Les Kaiser, I believe is how you pronounce that name. And you see like the ideas of what makes Alice Doesn't Live Here like a personal story for him, but also just like there's flourishes of this movie that are certainly very Scorsese. Like instantly into this movie, I'm like, oh yeah, this is a Martin Scorsese movie. When we get this, like, it kind of feels like The Wizard of Oz, I
I
think is
thought the
maybe
same
what he's
thing.
going
Yeah.
for
Mhm.
replicating, where it's just like you're with this like 8-year-old girl on this farm, and then it just drops it and she's like cursing up a storm, and it's a really funny sequence. But I'm just like, oh yeah, that's Scorsese. That's the Scorsese I know. And it's so fun to see him blend those two styles of filmmaking and storytelling within this one movie.
That opening sequence I love.
I
And
think it's my favorite scene in the movie.
watching it knowing, sorry, I rewatched the movie twice just to
Mhm.
be ready for this. And so watching it knowing what's to come, uh the beginning is so, not even just the scene with the farmhouse and the Technicolor filters and all that. The opening credits are straight out of Douglas Sirk, out of 1950s melodrama and women's pictures. I'm using quotes there, as they were called back then. These sweeping films about, women in trouble or going through romantic strife. And it opens with this little girl, and it's a smaller aspect ratio than is to come later in the film. And the colors are totally different. And even the set of the house looks false, like the movies of the time period. And then Scorsese literally blows that up by like slamming the screen into the center of the screen and then expanding the aspect ratio. And it's almost like he's saying, thank you so much, Douglas Sirk, for what you did. Love the movies. I got it from here.
Yeah, I'll
I'm
take
gonna
it from
look at
here.
it.
Like this is the
Exactly.
evolution of that. And it
Right.
certainly
So the
feels
new
like the
Hollywood version
evolution.
of those same subject matters.
Yeah, it certainly feels like the evolution of it. And I think that's so representative, obviously, of the history of what's going on in the 1950s and specifically the 1960s and 70s, how much American politics is in turmoil at that point, and how much civil rights impacts filmmaking, and how much the women's rights movement impacts filmmaking. It's certainly just it, and you identified it really early on in this movie, is Ellen, or I should say Alice in this movie, is very much feels like a woman of 1974 in a way that feels of 1974. And what shocked me was how timeless it also felt. Like it was just like, oh yeah, like this is aged much better than I thought this movie was going to age, to be honest. Like going into this movie yesterday, I'm like, there's going to be certain aspects of this movie that I just don't think Scorsese is capable of handling.
Right, and to your point about the specific politic of the era, you got to figure 1974. This is the middle of the women's lib movement, as it was called back then. You know, the second wave feminism, pop feminism is definitely in right now in terms of the types of movies being made and the music and all that, everything happening in culture. And this movie, I think, represents such an interesting fork in the road for depictions of female main characters in film, because I feel like a lot of, I'm speaking very broadly here, and again, we're two dudes talking about this,
exactly.
but I think speaking broadly, I'm sure a lot of women at the time could relate to this, because she's somebody who is clearly liberated in the very real way. She's aware of herself as a person. She knows to expect something from her life. She's not just, she doesn't want to be just second fiddle to somebody else in her life. But she also does crave the heteronormative stability of being with a man, being with somebody in your life that as a companion. And you see it happen 2 or 3 times in this movie, where she starts with this husband, obviously, and then she has the Harvey Keitel affair, which does not turn out well, obviously. And then Kris Kristofferson pops up when she least expects it. And all those men are vastly imperfect. None of them are without an abundance of flaws, if not more flaws than not. And yet she is drawn to them. And I think that's so interesting. I do think it's of its time period, because, you know, these are not these men that are perfect. And also Alice does not reject them. It really represents a very specific kind of wrestling that I'm sure a lot of women were doing back then with, yes, I wish to be, you know, the liberated woman that the magazines are telling me to be, but I also was raised in this environment that tells me to want this. And that's a tough dichotomy to square right there.
I think you hit it right on the head, where it is just like this full-on idea of just like, yeah, like I want that, but I've also lived my whole life as this. And that is the carefulness of this storytelling, which is this Martin Scorsese's script? I don't think it is, right? I think
no, it's somebody else wrote it entirely.
Yeah,
I don't have their name right here, but
what they do with it is they do present the turmoil of basically that human evolution is slower. Like we want to be at one point, but it does take us time to adjust, and especially if it's not something you're used to, like especially at the time period, like the behavior of the men in this movie, which I'm sure we'll get to, is like, that's my biggest qualm with this movie. It's just that I don't like Kris Kristofferson by the end of this movie. Like, just straight up think she should not be with him.
I don't disagree, because I think like the ending of the movie also points towards ambiguity. You know, the final moment in the diner is a moment of her seizing her own reality and saying, no, I'm gonna be a singer. Not I want to, or I think I should try it. I'm gonna be a singer, and you're more than welcome to join me or not. But you do still see her deferring her dreams. You know, one of the last moments of the movie is her talking to her kid and being like, would you mind if we don't go to Monterey right away? I know I keep saying we're gonna go to Monterey, but not just yet. I got to figure out this current chapter with Kris Kristofferson. And yeah, I also don't like him by the end of the movie. I don't think you're supposed to. I don't think you're supposed to be entirely won over, but like in so many relationships throughout history, I don't think everybody waits for the person to become perfected overnight before you go back to them or reconcile with them or whatever.
You read that you read that ending a little bit differently than I did, because I thought that, and maybe this is again slightly younger than you, growing up in a slightly different generation, was by the end of this movie, I did think Kris Kristofferson, like I thought they had presented him as the kind of hero turn. Like gotcha. I thought that was the intention of the filmmaker. So that was the element of the movie where I'm just like, I don't love that, and I don't think that would be in the cut of this movie today. It also just doesn't help that I'm not a Kris Kristofferson fan. Like, I just straight up, I like my relationship with him as an actor is just like a guy I've never liked in movies. So seeing him in this movie, I was just like, oh man, he's in here.
Yeah, and he's in a lot of them, so it's hard to escape.
Yeah, exactly. Like, there's an era of just Kris Kristofferson where Hollywood was like, he's our leading man, and I'm like, is he?
Must he be?
Yeah, do we really need this as our leading man? But one of the points that I totally forgot. I don't know how I spaced on this and like how I spaced on it in my note taking. Like Jodie Foster is in this movie. Like this is the start of where Martin Scorsese meets her and then obviously brings her in and just kind of revolutionary work in Taxi Driver. And it's this idea that I've had with Scorsese for a while, and we'll get back into some of the Oscar stuff because I'm really curious to hear just kind of your thoughts on the 1974 award ceremony. But Scorsese does such a good job as a director identifying who are the actors that will be one day famous. Like he identifies Jodie Foster at an incredibly young age and then re-identifies her again as like she's going to be great in Taxi Driver.
Mhm.
He does this with Harvey Keitel in Who's That Knocking at My Door. And then when he uses a more established actress like and I always forget, it's not Ellen Bernstein, right? Is that how you pronounce her
No,
last
it's Ellen Burstyn. Like she burst in
Burstyn.
through the door.
Burston. Okay, I'm gonna Burston. I keep wanting to say
Bernstein.
Bernstein. I'm mixing it up with Leonard Bernstein in
Mhm.
my head. But when he gets an actress like Ellen, who is an established actress at that point, he loves to he's so influenced by the idea of what a movie star is and what a movie star can do that he allows Ellen to just take another dimension as a star and really just lets her command the screen in a way that one is atypical for women at the time in this type of filmmaking, and two is atypical for just storytelling in general. I feel like at this time, I don't know if that
Right.
makes
I
sense.
no, it does, and I feel your pains trying not to use the word natural to describe this movie, but
Mhm.
it is so hard. It is so hard when you're looking at this performance from Ellen Burstyn. And like I said, it's not too different from the types of work she was doing up to this point. So I have to imagine she was bringing something of her abilities into the movie. And I didn't even put together, you're totally right. This is his first time working with somebody who was not a discovery of him, or at least not in the main role, because, you know, De Niro was a discovery practically in Mean Streets too, same thing.
Mhm.
Jodie Foster is so interesting in this movie because she has a tiny part. She has maybe 3 scenes as this tomboy friend of the son. And it is so interesting looking at her in this movie and then imagining Scorsese thinking she'd be perfect for Taxi Driver just 2 years later, where she's playing a baby doll, you know,
Mhm.
a caricature of a feminine little girl, you know, to the point of sexualization. And I think it's just so telling about Scorsese's ability, to your point, to pick out the best talent and who's best for the role, regardless of obvious qualities.
I think that's the factor that makes a director, like that's the it factor for me for a director, is can they identify talent and utilize talent in a way that's interesting slash unique? Because there's a lot of directors out there, especially now, who they can work with great talent and they can get great performances out of talent, but they don't seem to be able to identify what makes somebody talented necessarily. Scorsese is the exact opposite. Scorsese is somebody who's like, and it's this thing that I've been thinking about, especially as I've watched the later part of Scorsese's filmography, is he's like, I want to get this actor and I kind of want to mold them into being an actor that will be one day great, essentially. Like he does this with DiCaprio, I think probably most famously, where he's just like, because DiCaprio in Gangs of New York is probably about 5 years too young to play the role in Gangs of New York. Like he just doesn't have that leading man factor yet. Robert De Niro, even to some degree in Mean Streets, like I don't think he's fully there, and what he's not what he will become in Raging Bull, but he does take this moment to just be like, I see something in this person. I see something that maybe hasn't been done by other directors at the time, and I just want to like play with their image and also just slightly twist their image a little bit.
Well, in that vein, it's interesting that he doesn't, I don't think he does at least. I don't think he ever works with Ellen Burstyn again. And
Yeah, is
but then
that correct? Is she in New York Stories?
Or I have not seen New York Stories,
Okay,
so I don't know.
there's like a part of me that like almost want to say says that's on her IMDb, but I'm not sure.
That would make a lot of sense if she were. I haven't seen that film, but
Yeah,
let's find out
that's
real
one of the ones
fast.
I've missed at this moment as well. But I'm like, I was thinking of the list. I'm like, hang on.
New York Stories.
The issue is also which part of the director's movie is she in? Is she in the
She
Francis
is not
Ford?
in that movie. No.
She's not in.
So,
Okay.
yes.
Then yeah, I don't think she's ever worked with him post this.
No, and I part of that is I look at what's to come from Scorsese, and I don't know what I would put her in. Like there's. And this comes back to the critique of Scorsese, which I think is a shallow critique, but that he doesn't direct movies about women, at least in main roles. And to that point, I don't really know where she would go unless she was playing a smaller role, a step down from Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Like I don't know where she slots in because Alice is such a, again, idea of a unique film within Scorsese's filmography. 1974 Oscars, just off the top of your head. I'm trying to think, is this the Godfather Part 2 year?
Yes, Godfather 2 and Chinatown.
Okay, so of this year, and I'm looking it up right now. I wish I pulled it up. So Ellen Burstyn. I keep I have
Not
to look
Bernstein.
down each time. Each time I'm just looking down and being like, okay, confirming it. Okay, my God, this is an incredible year for film. But
Yes,
so
it
she
is.
is nominated for, or obviously Alice, again with that competition. The big name I see is, of course, Faye Dunaway in Chinatown. And then Valerie Perrine. Is that how you pronounce her name?
I believe it's Perrin in Lenny.
Perrine,
yeah.
For Lenny. Just oh my God. The one that I can't believe it because obviously of these movies, I definitely think Burstyn has the best performance out of all these. Then looked over to the best actor, which I actually don't think I knew up until this moment. I obviously knew Pacino loses it in Godfather Part 2. I did not realize he loses to Art Carney in Harry and Tonto.
Yes, Harry and Tonto. It is have you seen it?
No, I've never seen it.
Not very good. It's a total. It's actually not dissimilar in many ways to Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore because I believe it's also a road movie, but instead of a woman and her son, it's a man and his cat. It was a total career win. He beats Nicholson in Chinatown, Dustin Hoffman and Lenny, and Albert Finney, I believe, was the other one.
Albert Finney, which is just a crazy like list of where the other 4 performances I have seen. And then it's just like Art Cart. Oh my God, that's a crazy.
Yeah, that's an infamous win right there.
Oh my God, I literally can't. I'm kind of like flabbergasted at this point. And then is this movie nominated for any other awards?
I believe screenplay and supporting actress for Diane Ladd.
That's right. Diane does get nominated. Screenplay, it loses to Chinatown, which also that year.
Can't really argue with that.
Hard to argue with Chinatown. Also nominated that year is The Conversation, Day for Night, and Harry and Tonto again.
Yep.
So at least it won in that category, at least. Or I should say at least Chinatown won in that category, and it wasn't Harry and Tonto sweep. Let's just get into a little bit more focused on the movie, which I feel like I've actually done a bad job this episode, really jumping into the plot of this movie. But so essentially, for those who do not know what this movie is about, this character, Alice Hyatt, her husband dies at the beginning of the movie. He is in it at the very least. I think does he hit the child at the beginning of the movie? I don't know if we ever actually see him being physically.
There's a scene where he like chases him around the dinner table. It's you can pretty much assume he's hitting this kid from what you're given.
Yeah, I think it would be safe to call him an abusive father / husband. He dies in like a car crash. I think is he a truck driver? I believe.
I got truck driver. Yeah.
Yeah, because he dies in a truck. She then she wants to move to Monterey to become a singer. Doesn't exactly go as planned. She ends up in Tucson, Arizona for a little bit, becomes a waitress at a diner, meets Harvey Keitel's character, and then goes on later and meets Kris Kristofferson's character in this movie. I think that's a fairly decent summary of this movie. And apparently,
Right,
Martin
that's the thing,
Scorsese-
is the plot is not, there's not much to it. It's more about the experiences within the plot.
Yeah, and I just noticed this. I miss Martin Scorsese in this movie. He's in the movie at one point.
Oh, I missed that too. Doesn't,
He
he's
is.
in a
It
lot of
says
movies around this time, so that makes sense.
he says he cameos as a customer in Mel's Diner. So I'm just like, I'm trying to think of what scene that was, but I'm just like, oh, usually I catch the Scorsese.
Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
lot of people in those diners, though, like a comical amount of people in the diner.
But so let's focusing back in on this movie. Not what makes it endearing for you, because you've already kind of qualified that. What made you want to choose this movie specifically? Besides the fact that I had to switch you last second from Raging Bull to Alice to a
I was gonna say,
comedy.
part was a matter of timing.
Yeah.
But I watched this most recently before you asked me to be on the show, and I was struck by it. I was really impressed with it, especially for a movie I'd seen before and not have been so taken by. And I think there's a lot to go into here about typical styles and movements of the new Hollywood era, which is one of my favorite eras of Hollywood. Especially because this is a movie, to your point about the plot not being too dense. This is not a Chinatown as a point of comparison is a very plot heavy movie, very twisty turny, a lot of characters, a lot of plot moments and beats and twists. And this is not that. This is much closer to something like Easy Rider, or even something like Bonnie and Clyde, which has plot, but is more of a hangout time with these characters. And those movies, I think, have a tendency to have a surprisingly stronger legacy than some of the more plotty movies of the era. Probably because they're so lived in and you can hang out with the characters for a significant amount of time. Yeah, I think it's just an interesting movie to look at, both in terms of Hollywood trajectories and, like we were talking about earlier, the political trajectories of the time period.
It's also so interesting to me, and I guess this kind of just relates to just 2023, is the fact of just how different Hollywood filmmaking is at this point, where like this movie was a huge success, where in 2023 it just doesn't feel like this movie would have as big of an impact, weirdly enough, because it just I don't know even how to describe it. I've been thinking about it a lot, where it's just like these star driven vehicles were made for reasonable budgets. They made reasonable amount of money back. And this is a not a star churning performance because she's already a star, but this is the movie that gets Ellen Burstyn her Oscar. And I was just like, wow, I was trying to think of which actress, if this movie came out today, which actress plays that role, and two, which director is making this movie. And I guess my answer ended up kind of being like, this is Greta Gerwig. Probably this is a Greta Gerwig movie.
I was gonna say
like I'm like, this is to the closest when I was watching this movie. And obviously I have Barbie on the brain, given that it is July 24th. So I just saw Barbie a few days ago, and I'm also from Sacramento and live in Sacramento. So Greta Gerwig is basically always on my mind.
Yeah.
But like, that was the comparison where I'm just like, this is a Greta Gerwig indie A24 darling, not like like a profitable studio movie starring one of its like greatest like leading ladies up to that point.
Yeah, it's just a mechanism of the industry that's not there anymore. I mean, we can look to again, it's Barbenheimer weekend, so we can't not talk about it. We can look to things like Barbie and Oppenheimer as points of hope in the industry, because they are if you want to call a movie based on a doll, original, but compared to yet another comic movie, definitely original. Looks at modern day life with definite directorial flourishes, and they are bringing people to the theater for things that haven't been bringing people to the theater in a while, but not because there's been a lot of failures on those types of movies, because there hasn't been an option to go see them. So if we're speaking to a modern audience that would look to something like Alice's Living Anymore, I don't think we can pretend that this would be a huge hit nowadays, because it just wouldn't. But I think to your comparison about Lady Bird, which I had the same exact thought
Mm.
watching this movie again. There's definitely an audience out there for it.
Exactly. And one of the other aspects, again, because watch the movie, we're recording this episode, disclaimer, we're recording this episode Monday, July 24th. So I saw this movie Sunday, July 23rd for the first time. And the aspect for me that was just like, this is always and again, I've kind of talked about it, but this is the fun part of this series for me, where it's kind of recontextualizing a director. And Scorsese in particular is a guy that I think was always so closely associated with the gangster genre of movie making that, like, going into this movie, I was just so not even shocked, but it was just like, this is the ability of genre storytelling that Scorsese is able to tackle is kind of astonishing. Like, because, and I'll give you the example. The past 3 Scorsese movies that I've watched in order was After Hours, Kundu, and Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. Like, those were the past 3 that I've watched, which are 3 very different movies for Scorsese's filmography. And I'm just like, it's almost tonal whiplash where I'm just like, these don't even feel like they're the same director.
Right, and you have to, like, when you watch movies that are that different from the same director, you try to find the connective thread, not necessarily in terms of style or perspective, but what drew him as a director and an artistic voice to these stories. I haven't seen After Hours or Kundun, so I can't speak to those specifically, but I think a lot of times he's drawn to, it feels cliche to say, like, strong characters, because I would hope most directors are, but truly, you look at somebody like Raging Bull or Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, or even something like Wolf of Wall Street. These are people who are, to varying degrees, realistically flawed. You get somebody as criminally flawed as Jordan Belfort in Wolf of Wall Street, or as realistically, forgivably flawed as Alice. And it really just encompasses so much of, like, the people that we meet every day, because nobody's perfect. Nobody's an ideal person. And I think Scorsese is drawn to exploring how people operate within those flaws and make connections because of and in spite of them.
Yeah, it's one of his best characteristics of the stories that he chooses to tell, which is, and also the way he chooses to tell the story, because you're right, this movie could have been so easy a cliche. Like, we've seen this movie even before 1974. We've seen this movie done hundreds of times. And the fact that even watching it in the context of 2023, it's watching as many movies as I have seen, the fact that this felt new and inventive and just another way to present a story was just so great to me, where I'm just like, this could have easily just been a kind of forgettable movie. And with a worse director at hands, and I guess that's unfair to say, like, any worse director probably would make a worse movie, but like, this could have gone so easily below the rug, right? Or swept under the rug, where it's just like, it's forgotten. Like, she made this movie and it's kind of whatever. Maybe it even wins her Oscar, because they're just like, we need to give Ellen Burstyn her award finally.
Yeah, and I would be interested to see how the script, I don't want to take away from what the screenwriter did, but how much of the script was drawn upon from the natural interactions between Alice rather, and her son and her other characters, because not to say it feels improvised, but it does feel so spontaneous throughout that it's either speaks to the abilities of the actors and director, or a really astute screenwriter to capture authentic, if we want to call it authentic, or believable dialogue and interactions.
I'll call it improv if you don't want to do it, because that was the feel that I was getting for this movie, where it just does kind of feel like these two actors in the mom and the son are just kind of riffing with each other. Like, it does just feel like there's probably like hundreds of hours of tape of these two just having the same interactions, just slightly different based on how they're performing at that scene. Like, there is something very loose to this filmmaking in a way that, again, it's this another just fun wrinkle in this movie is just like, this is a very loose directed movie. Like it feels very hands off in a really special type of way, and especially for a director that I don't usually consider hands off.
Sure. And, I think of scenes like one of my favorite scenes in the movie is this great scene, which you can totally see being cut because it has nothing to do with the plot. And again, plot as in so much plot as there is in this movie, which is to say very little. It's the scene where the Alice and her son are sitting in the car on one of their endless journeys, and we just cut in to see the son trying to tell this stupid joke to his mom, and we don't even get the punchline ourselves. We don't know what the joke is. So we're totally on Alice's side when we see how just confused and frustrated she is, and the kid just keeps telling the joke over and over again, and Ellen is confused to the point of almost tears, and it's a genuinely hilarious scene, and it feels so true to life. It feels so well observed to the types of interactions that mothers and kids have, where there's you want to understand what your kid is saying, but oh my god, they're so annoying. What is going on here? What are we doing here? I just want to cry.
Yeah, that's a really well put way to say that. Sorry if I keep like stuttering. I just got a what's it called, root canal done, so there's just like certain words I can't like pronounce. Like so I just fun. Like try like making a word, and I just feel in the back of my mouth like, you're not making that word today.
No. Well, the perfect time to hop on a podcast for now.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just like, let's do it right now. But I think we could kind of start wrapping up our conversation on this movie here and kind of jump to the second part of this. One last point that I want to bring up, and this is more of just a question for you, is what makes the movie for you? Is it the performance? Is it the direction? Is it the writing? Is it the cheat answer of like, it's all of the above? Or like is there a single standout for you in this?
This is one of those movies where all three of those elements, those major elements that make up the heart of any movie, are working so perfectly in tandem that it's impossible to separate them and say, well, the acting is amazing or the blah blah is amazing. And it's easy to say, well, the acting must be great because she won an Oscar, and
exactly.
That is true. This is a good Oscar win. It's not one of those just career ones that is kind of just thrown to an actor in their twilight years.
How dare you? Gary Oldman was great in Darkness. Do you know how rough it was that like revisit, or not? Actually, I guess it was revisiting because I saw Oppenheimer again yesterday, and just being like, Gary Oldman's like better in this like 2-minute sequence than he is in his entire Oscar win to at least me.
So is Rami Malek in the same movie.
That's the Oscar win that drives me the craziest, is him winning for Bohemian Rhapsody.
Yeah, it's the worst performance I've ever seen win an Oscar in my lifetime.
I think I'm in agreement, especially because if like you wanted to give it to the guy who's singing, like Bradley Cooper was just right there. Giving it
the war flashbacks I'm having to that Oscar.
I know. I literally am sitting there and I'm just like, oh yeah. Oh god, what was I talking about? I just like, I'm now just in the Rami Malek and fake teeth winning an Oscar mode. Right?
A dark place to be in.
Yeah,
it's that the acting and the writing and the directing all working together so well. And the funny thing is, like, my instinct is to say, well, when a movie is good in all those departments, you credit the director because they're wrangling it all. They're pulling it all together. It's their vision. So I guess I'd have to say the direction. But what's funny is that I haven't seen all of his films, but it is interesting looking at this movie and seeing his directorial style and what he does with the material, and looking at his later things and trying to find points of comparison. And I feel like there's not as many as you'd think there would be, which again, I think just only shows his flexibility, which I feel like is something he's not credited for, at least by the general public. So yes, the direction is just astonishing.
What's interesting to me about it is like to a degree of how much he doesn't return to this type of direction style or even like mode of storytelling. And yet like every one of his peers post this kind of takes the Alice Doesn't Live Here approach to some degree in their filmmaking. Like I feel like there is certainly elements of this movie that end up kind of becoming an Albert Brooks style movie.
Oh, sure.
Even a Woody Allen type movie, or
James L. Brooks.
Yeah, Mel. Oh, sorry, who was the name you threw out?
James L. Brooks. I'm thinking
Okay,
like
I'm
Terms
like,
of
I
Endearment.
thought you said
Yeah.
Mel Brooks, so I was saying it for a second. I'm like, wait a second, like that's
No,
not
not Mel Brooks.
or even
Famous
like
subtle naturalist director in Mel Brooks.
yeah, I'm blanking on her name right now, but When Harry Met Sally, not Rob Reiner, sorry, not When Harry Met Sally.
Nora Ephron.
Nora Ephron, thank you. Like,
Yeah.
there's so much of that where you see, like, I'm sure those Alice Doesn't Live Here was an influence because you see it in their works, and it's just like Scorsese's like kind of like, again, not to say that this movie doesn't feel like a Scorsese movie at all times, but like there is certainly a kind of one and done element to this movie where it's just like, I got this out of me. Like I wanted to make this type of movie, wanted to practice with this, and like now I'm moving on. And I'm gonna do, and it's maybe just also like a director just trying to find style. Like it is certainly a case of he's so young in his career that he's just like, let me try everything and see what I like doing.
Right. I have to like look more at his filmography as a whole to kind of parse out what he takes from this as a learning experience almost.
Yeah, no,
But it's definitely an interesting chapter in his career if you're looking at his career on the whole.
So with that all said, let's kind of just jump to the end of this segment. I don't know. I hope I sent it in my show notes to you, but I had a few questions for you to kind of end the show.
Yeah.
I'll
Yeah, I got
start
them.
with, let's do the top 5 at the end, actually. So let's just start with some of the more fun ones. Who is somebody that you would love to see work with Martin Scorsese?
Okay, so this might be because I watched it kind of recently, but I saw New York, New York. Have you seen that one yet?
No, I'm
On your
actually that is being recorded, I think, first week of August. So I gotta watch it this weekend.
Gotcha. It is really long. So there's
Isn't it
that.
like 2 hours and 45?
Yeah, it's
Oh.
long and I loved it. It feels you feel the length. It is not a
Okay.
quick movie.
Okay.
Just warning you. But I really loved it. It's totally strange and so heartfelt. It's totally him doing the crazy thing is it stars Liza Minnelli, and it's
Yeah.
totally the kind of movie that her mom would have made 30 years earlier. She's playing a character in post World War II America, a big band singer. And unless I'm really missing something, unless you want to count his music documentaries, it's his only musical. And it's even not so much a musical. There's very little singing that is not like a band performing. So it's almost something like A Star is Born in that sense. But it got me thinking, I would love to see him do another musical. I don't know what it would be. But I was trying to think of people who would fit Scorsese's, who could be in a Scorsese movie generally, who also can sing. And so I came with a little mini cast where I was thinking
Okay,
I'd love
go.
to see him work with Lady Gaga,
Yeah.
Christopher Walken, and Patti LuPone, who was recently in Beau's Afraid.
Yeah.
Yeah, as the mom at the end, but she's this incredible Broadway actress who can like sing her face off. And I just think all of them would work so well within Scorsese's ideologies and what he does with movies, specifically if he were to turn back to music. I don't think that's ever going to happen, but I just think it'd be a totally unexpected thing for him to do, and I would love to see it.
You got the next best thing. What if instead of Martin Scorsese, I gave you Todd Phillips doing Joker 2?
Okay, interesting. You got
That's
me on
my
board.
best offer for you. So you can.
I'll take it.
I've for each episode that I'm doing, I'm also trying to think of like a new answer to this. And like I was trying to base it I always try to base it off the movie that we're talking about. Like who could give, maybe not the same type of performance that Ellen Burstyn does in this movie, but who could maybe capture a similar energy. And what like, because last time I answered Jennifer Lawrence, and I'm actually like kind of stuck on that name for a second. I'm just like, actually, I think she could do it. I just like, is it like a cheap answer to just say Emily Blunt? Like, is it just like,
I would love that.
Go for it. What was that?
The thing about Jennifer Lawrence is her performance in American Hustle is basically a Scorsese character.
It
so you can totally see what she would do with the material. And that's, not to compare David O. Russell to Martin Scorsese, because there are leagues between them as directors, and I even like American Hustle. But Emily Blunt would be interesting. I would wonder, I'm trying to think of the role she would play for him.
I don't know either. Like, because Jennifer Lawrence, I had a really clear pitch. I'm like, she's the Mark Wahlberg in The Departed type of energy.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
But then like Emily Blunt, I'm just like hung up on like, am I just going because it's the best actress, one of my favorite actresses?
Sure.
The
Yeah.
other
And
name
you
I
just
was
saw
thinking was,
Oppenheimer.
yeah, the other name I was thinking was Lupita Nyong'o. Well, I was
Okay.
just like,
Yeah.
okay, like there is something actually so real about how she is as a performer, specifically thinking how Jordan Peele uses her in Us.
Ugh,
So I'm
an
like, there
amazing
is
performance.
certainly
Yeah.
an element of it. Toni Collette, actually. Maybe I'm just thinking a lot of mothers in movies. Like, who was a great mother in a movie the
Yeah.
past
Well,
like
Jennifer
5 years?
Lawrence, speaking of mother.
Yeah. So like those were some of the names that I came up with for this exercise. And I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I could definitely see Emily Blunt or Lupita getting a role with Scorsese eventually, hopefully. Maybe
I
not
would
in the
love it.
Jesus movie. That might be a little weird. But the next question I have for you is, who is somebody that never got the chance to work with Martin Scorsese before they passed, that as a film fan you would have loved to have seen it work? And it doesn't have to be of the time period. It doesn't have
Sure.
to be like they had to be alive when Scorsese was making movies.
Yeah, so I came up with people who died before Scorsese was making movies. So my first one,
Perfect.
and I just mentioned her, is Judy Garland. I totally think she could have brought
Mm-hmm.
something, especially later in her career, in like her Judgment at Nuremberg era, where she was uh, playing much more openly dramatic roles. But she has such a fragile emotionality. She always feels like on the verge of crying, even when she's singing something happy. And I think that energy could do well in a Scorsese movie. The other one is an actor who I don't hear a lot of people talk about anymore very much, but he's totally somebody that is one of my favorites from what I've seen. His name is John Garfield. Are you familiar with him?
No, I don't. If you told me movies he's in, I might be.
So the biggest thing I've seen him in is his Oscar nomination is for a movie called Body and Soul, where he plays a boxer.
I
Uh,
know that movie.
yes, it's a great movie. He's amazing in it. And he was somebody who will he died in the 50s at like before he even hit 40. So he never had he didn't have a very long career. He got brought in front of HUAC. So his career was cut very short. But he's been acknowledged by a lot of younger actors, people who would go on to foster the energy that a lot of Scorsese actors would bring into their work. People like Marlon Brando, James Dean, who then obviously influenced people like De Niro and Pacino. He's credited before them as somebody who really brings that kind of like raw energy into his movies. And I just think he could really do something. I could totally see him as an almost, if he had made it to the 70s, I could totally see him playing one of the older men in Mean Streets or Taxi Driver or something like that. And I would love to see it.
I think that's a really good call. I'm trying to pull up my actress's name, and I'm actually trying to now also confirm. I don't think she was ever in a Scorsese movie. She would be alive for like the beginning of his career. Ingrid Bergman. That's the tooth. Just like
Canal.
Ingrid Bergman
Mhm.
from Casablanca. She never was in a Scorsese movie, right?
No.
Okay. I think she'd be excellent, especially if she's like doing the level of performance near of what she does Casablanca, which, spoiler alert, is one of my favorite movies of all time. Like
Good
top
pick.
4. Yeah, I don't think it's that controversial. Just turn the TikTok cameras on. Like Casablanca is a good movie. Like I don't think that's like that controversial to say, but there is certainly an element of her as a performer that I would really like to see. And I guess to a degree, Humphrey Bogart would also be quite interesting to see in a Scorsese movie. Just since it's Barbenheimer, I'll also go in the spirit of it. Just rewatching JFK this weekend, John Candy would have been incredible.
Oh man, yeah, I can totally see him in something like Casino or something.
Oh, that's the movie I put him into. I'm like, he could just be smoking a cigarette in Casino, just chain smoking for a few minutes. And now the biggest question of all, Cody, and I'll be honest, I'm not revealing my pick until the Irishman episode comes out with Keith Phipps. So I'm not revealing my top 5. But what is your top 5 of Martin Scorsese movies?
Okay, I have to prerequisite declare. Like I mentioned earlier, I watched a lot of Scorsese movies from like the pre-Shutter Island era when I was young and haven't come back to a lot of them. So I'm in the process of revisiting movies that I didn't love the first time, such as Raging Bull, Age of Innocence, things like that. That being said, my top 5 is, I don't want to say boring because they're all great movies, but do you want me to go 5 through 1? Would that be the best way to do this?
Yeah, I think that's the most suspenseful.
Yeah.
I feel like if you just go with one, everyone like just is like, all right, we're good.
Yeah, exactly. Well, because it's relevant, I'll say my number 6 is Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. So
Okay.
good job. For 5, I have The Irishman, a great movie I was happy to see in theaters. I was lucky to catch that on the actual big screen.
Oh, sorry, you lagged out there for a second. So all I heard was number 5 was The Irishman.
Yes, number 5 was The Irishman, which is a movie I was lucky to have seen in an actual theater. I got to see it on the big screen, which is awesome. Number 4 is Taxi Driver, which is a movie I watched recently for the first time in a few years, and it's pretty phenomenal. Amazing screenplay from Paul Schrader. De Niro is unbelievable. Number 3, I have The Wolf of Wall Street, which is just such a weirdly good time. You know, it's maximalist filmmaking, but I think the point it's making about unfettered capitalism is totally astute, and I think the way you see people talk about the movie as a like point of desire, as something to aspire to, only further proves the point of the film is making. Number 2, I have The Departed, which is just like a fun, tight movie. It's just so well made, and there's just very little holes to poke in it. And then again, I feel so boring saying this, but number 1 is Goodfellas. It's just the best. It's just the best.
Can I tell you, I saw The Irishman as Martin Scorsese always intended on my iPhone 8 in a library classroom in Chico State.
Wow. Was it all in one sitting at least?
No, of course not. It was like 5 days. It was because it came out right when my finals were happening in college. Like it was, I think, my senior year. Yeah, it was definitely my senior year.
Christmas
so
time.
It literally came out to Netflix when I was taking finals. So like that dead week, as they called it, like I was watching The Irishman whenever I could. And so I was just watching it like kind of like 30 minutes at a time.
Yeah.
And then still ended up being one of my favorite movies of that year. But
you watched it the Quibi, my joke's being ruined by my mouth, by the Quibi method.
I watched it the Zack Snyder Justice League method, where it's like part 1 through part 7.
See, I watched it the way that Scorsese probably actually did want to watch it, which is on a Tuesday afternoon, where I'm the youngest one in the theater by like 40 years, just watching The Irishman in one sitting.
Well, Cody, I just want to thank you for coming on the show, and I want to give you a second to plug anything you are working on / where the people can find you.
Of course, this has been great. Thank you so much for having me on. Talk about a pretty good director.
I
you
think
can
he's
find
a
me.
Pretty good director. Yeah.
I think
he's earned his stripes.
We'll see what he does next. Anyway, my name is Cody. You can find me on all the social medias. You can find me on Instagram, Twitter /X. Maybe we're calling it by
do
now.
remember this will come out in September, so Twitter might not be the thing.
Honestly, probably would be better if it was not a thing, but if it is, you can find me on there. I'm on Letterboxd, Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky, all under Cody Monster 91. I write and podcast with Next Best Picture, so I'm all over that place. And I also have my own podcast called Halloweeners, a horror movie podcast, which is a totally loosey-goosey, release it whenever we want podcast with one of my best friends, where we just go through a horror movie every episode. Just a good, stupid time.
Nice. And guys, thank you all for watching. Cody, thank you for joining me for today's episode. We will be back tomorrow, which, if I'm correct, that is, yes, it is. It is Taxi Driver tomorrow with my guest, not booked yet. We're recording this in July. I have no clue who will be my guest for Taxi Driver.
I've heard great things about Not Booked Yet. He's so smart. Good pick.
He was really hard to book. But anyway, so we will be back with Taxi Driver tomorrow. Anyway, from the Beneverse Movie Channel, thank you for watching. Take care and bye-bye.